Electric car or petrol? Full cost breakdown you didn't expect. First, we have to look at the purchase price. If you want a small family hatchback like a Ford Fiesta or a Volkswagen Golf, then they cost around 20 to 30,000 pounds. But if you want a medium-sized SUV like a Tesla Model Y or BMW X3, it costs about 50 to 60,000 pounds. To be fair, there are cheaper electric cars than this, such as the Renault Zoe or the Nissan Leaf, but they're not very good. They don't go very far, and that's why hardly anyone buys them. The cheapest model at Tesla is the Model 3, which costs about 45 grand. And the cheapest model at Ford is the Mustang Mach-E, which costs about 43 grand. On the petrol side of things, there's a much wider variety of vehicles to choose from across all budgets. For example, if you want an SUV, you can get a Toyota Yaris Cross for around 25 grand. That's 25 grand less than the cheapest Mustang Mach-E. And if you want a really cheap car, then the Dacia Sandero Stepway costs just 17 grand. However, electric cars are getting cheaper every year, whereas petrol cars are getting more expensive. So in the future, the gap between the two will shrink. In the past, people would lease their cars because it was the only way to get a nice car without paying for it upfront. Today, leasing is even more popular with electric cars because the latest models come with huge upfront incentives to help you switch. For example, right now you can lease a Tesla Model 3 for just £499 a month with a £5,000 deposit. That's half the cost of a Model 3 a few years ago. And when you consider that the average person spends £360 a month on their car, £499 isn't actually too bad. What's more, most leases include the cost of servicing, maintenance, and insurance, so you just have one monthly payment to worry about instead of multiple payments for different companies. Now, how does this compare to petrol? Well, it's impossible to say exactly how much a petrol car costs these days because it depends on whether you buy it outright, lease it, or even subscribe to it like you can with a Mercedes. But let's take the Toyota Yaris Cross, which costs 25,000 pounds. On finance, you could pay £8,000 upfront and then £300 a month for the next 4 years. It seems like a good deal until you factor in fuel costs. According to ZapMap, the average cost of charging an electric car is 21 pence per mile. And since most electric cars have a range of around 300 miles, your average monthly charging cost will be about £15. It costs twice as much to charge an EV at home as it does at a public charger. But according to ZapMap, 70% of drivers charge their EVs at home, meaning that the average monthly charging cost for an electric vehicle is closer to £7.50 rather than £15. I think you can agree that that's pretty cheap. But what about petrol? Well, according to the rack, the average petrol car uses 13.4 miles per gallon. Now, obviously, this varies depending on the type of driving you do, but let's assume that you drive mostly in towns where you'd use more fuel. At 13.4 miles per gallon, you'd get 342 miles out of a full tank, which means that you'd fill up once a week. With petrol costing £173, you'd spend £173 on fuel every week, which equals £772 a month. This is 9 times as much as the average electric car, which means that electric cars save you a lot of money in the long run. So far, electric cars seem like a no-brainer. They're cheaper, easier to own, and they save you money on fuel. But what about the cost of living crisis? Surely buying an electric car requires a large down payment and a large monthly payment, right? Well, not really. Since the government reduced their grants last year, you'll only receive a £500 discount when you buy an electric car, but on top of this, most manufacturers offer their own discounts, which often cover the cost of the grant entirely. Tesla is currently offering £5,000 off any Model 3 order, whereas Volkswagen is offering £4,000 off any ID for order. And since electric cars are worth more than petrol cars, you can put your old car towards the cost of your new one. So overall, an electric car isn't that expensive after all. It's a similar story with leasing as well. Because of the incentives and tax breaks available to businesses, you can lease a Tesla Model 3 for less than £500 a month, which is cheaper than most family hatchbacks. But what about petrol? As I mentioned earlier, it depends on whether you buy the car, lease it, or even subscribe to it like some manufacturers offer. But let's stick with leasing for simplicity's sake. According to Lease Car, you can lease the Toyota Yaris Cross for £276 a month. Sounds pretty cheap until you factor in the fuel costs. The cheapest way to refuel your car is by using a fuel card like this one from Texaco. Their diesel and petrol prices are both 167 liters. And since the average petrol car holds 55 liters of fuel, you'd spend £93 to fill up. Now, obviously, you won't fill up every day unless you drive a lot, but let's assume that you fill up once a week. That means that you'd spend £378 a month on fuel alone, which adds another £900 to your monthly payment. In other words, leasing a petrol car costs almost double the price of leasing an electric car. You might be thinking, surely used cars are much cheaper. Well, here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether you buy a used petrol car or a used electric car because used cars have lost so much value already. According to Auto Trader, the average car loses 19% of its value as soon as it has driven off the forecourt, and 63% of its value over 5 years. So a petrol car will be 63% more expensive than a used electric car, which means that petrol cars aren't really any cheaper. Finally, let's talk about insurance. People tend to think that insuring an electric car is expensive because it is more complex and difficult to repair. But actually, electric cars are safer and less likely to be stolen, which means that they're cheaper to insure. Electric cars also require less maintenance because they have fewer parts, which means that insurance premiums are lower. I found a quote for £1,700 for a Tesla Model 3 and £1,400 for the Toyota Yaris Cross. And again, this difference in cost is even greater when you factor in the cost of leasing. To conclude, electric cars are undoubtedly cheaper than petrol cars. They're cheaper to buy, cheaper to lease, cheaper to run, and cheaper to insure. There are so many benefits to switching, which is why the government has banned the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. It is only 8 years away. And if you want to make the switch but you're struggling with the upfront costs, you can sell your current car, get a Tesla Model 3, and still have enough money left over to charge it up for a whole month. Thank you very much for watching. Consider subscribing and supporting my content.